My paper this morning is Reckoning with Canada's Slave Past, from the Transatlantic Slave Trade to the 2020 Social Uprising. Canadians have been engaging in a lot of conversation and some learning along, a wide spectrum about race and racism, from police brutality to anti-Black racism in education, to the disparities in the healthcare system. And these conversations continue taking place over the past year on social media, as well as on traditional media and on virtual platforms like this due to the COVID pandemic. And we've seen a lot of, for those of us who are on social media, have seen a lot of these exchanges and this information coming across our feeds. In sharp focus this year has been the realities of the global manifestation of anti-Black racism, propelled by the public outrage and demonstrations during the spring and summer of 2020 in response to the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Canadians have been seeking more historical understanding, the context to anti-Black racism that's rooted in the insidious history and the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade and the institution of enslavement, whose tentacles are entrenched in the realities that people of African descent face today. In the tracing of the roots of anti-Black racism to the 400-year history of chattel enslavement and the identification of some of the imperialist colonists that were implicated in the structuring, expansion, and evolution of this institution, a connected conversation surfaced, or resurfaced, I should say, about public monuments that honored these white privileged men and whether they should remain in public spaces. These threads of discourse and debate during a time when I was delving deeper into my dissertation research elucidated for me how, as James Baldwin expressed, that history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. Like many of you as grad students, my almost completed archival research for my dissertation has been stalled by COVID, and the restrictions around where we live. My dissertation, One Too Many, examines the enslavement of African people in early Ontario between 1760 and 1830. And my research has led me to archives of various kinds in order to further unearth this history and the stories of the men, women, and children who were enslaved. In carrying on my research from home and online during our lockdown restrictions and working on other aspects of my research, I have been pulling together my findings over the past year in the midst of social unrest and in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. I observed an increase in the conversation and the dialogues about the reality that African people were enslaved in Canada, and I participated and contributed to these conversations. I was invited to write an article that wound up being 2 articles for Spacing magazine. This process of writing these articles helped me to synthesize my thoughts on my research. My first article is the most read article online for the publication. Shortly after this, we noticed, or it was shared on social media, that a couple of guerrilla signs, so placed by someone, not part of an installation process, so someone just placed these signs, they began to appear along a few streets in Toronto that were named after 3 Loyalist families, the Babet family and the Jarvis family. And not too long after, a 3rd sign appeared on the Russell family. And so I'll tell you a little bit about these individuals and these families. As you see, these guerrilla signs were very strategically placed in locations that were named after these families, some of the individuals and the families in general. The Jarvis here, the sign was placed beside the official, if you will, Ontario Heritage plaque commemorating Jarvis Collegiate, named after the Jarvis family. Not William Jarvis, the son Jarvis, but still part of this Loyalist elite family. The William Jarvis and his wife Hannah, they moved here to Ontario, settled in Niagara and on the lake for a short time for William to take up a post in the newly formed provincial government. William and Hannah, they enslaved a number of Black people in Niagara on the lake. And when he was taking up his post in the government, when the Parliament building moved to Toronto, they brought with them, they relocated, their family relocated and brought with them the Black people that they enslaved. And so this is, and just briefly, the Jarvis family. One of the first signs that popped up was the sign here around Babé Point, named after the Babé family. This was a Francophone family, a French family, who were part of the political and economic elite and were was a loyalist leaning family. They initially were in Detroit under British control, and when it was turned over, that Detroit was turned over to the Americans finally, years after the end of the American Revolution, the remaining loyalists, including the Babé family, settled in Windsor, Sandwich and Windsor, Ontario. And the Babé family from Detroit, that was a British possession and included the Windsor area, they enslaved about 18 Indigenous, Black and biracial individuals. And when they moved to the British side, the Canadian side, they brought with them a number of those that they enslaved. And the father actually bequeathed a number of those that they enslaved to his sons, Francois and James, who were also part of the political elite and members of the legislation. And then the third sign that showed up in the fall, I believe it was in regards to the Russell family, Peter and his stepsister, Elizabeth Russell. They resided in Toronto. Again, Peter was a politician and he was the provincial administrator. And in relocating again from Niagara-on-the-Lake to Toronto, between that time somehow and arriving to Toronto, he came to enslave a family of 4, a mother and 3 children, Peggy, Amy, Millie, and Jupiter. And the husband and father, Pompadour, was actually a free man who remained in the employ of Peter Russell. So Pompadour seems to have been, more than likely, he was a Black loyalist. So he was enslaved and received his freedom in exchange for service during the American Revolution. However, his family remained enslaved. And when we look at some of these examples, we see that some of these loyalist founders and first politicians, that they themselves had no inclination to free those that they enslaved, and that they moved with them from the temporary residence in Niagara-on-the-Lake into Toronto. These signs were an anonymous intervention into the colonized rendering of the landscape, with the urban landscape of Toronto, but also the far reaches in terms of the Niagara area and also in the Windsor area as well. And these colonial renderings erases the history of the historically oppressed Indigenous people, those who were enslaved in these spaces, and they glorify they glorify displacement. Interject these signs, the temporary signs, interject and overlay the historical reality of enslavement. They revise the sanitized narratives of settler colonialism and acknowledge the 206-year history of enslavement in colonial Canada. In this intentional intervention, the signs name the Black men, women, and children who were enslaved by these white settler families. These temporary plaques also raise some critical questions, questions about the intersections of race, colonization, landscape, and public spaces. They also prompt us to reconsider who is memorialized and who has been excised from our shared past. Historical events, we know which historical events are remembered, forgotten, and or erased. And what are these processes that leads to these determinations? The conversations that are pushing us to confront the realities and interconnections of anti-Black racism and colonial memorials have collided. And it has illustrated the continuity of how Black lives, both enslaved and free, past and present, are dehumanized. Some people would prefer that the harsh truth of the history of enslavement in Canada not be investigated. It can be unsettling for some people to have the foundational and especially laudatory views of Canada and early Ontario disrupted. Some have verbalized how little they regarded the lives of Black people, of enslaved Black people. And this came through in some of the negative racist public comments to my research, which were particularly upsetting to read in the context of reading this past year, which has been difficult at times while witnessing the uprisings and the violence against Black people in real time during a pandemic that has disproportionately impacted Black and other racialized people. And I know they say sometimes you shouldn't read the comments, but I view those as part of the conversation and expressions of attitudes and beliefs that I think are important in terms of understanding individual but also collective perspectives. I argue that now is a pivotal time for Canada to reckon with its history of Black chattel enslavement, which was a very particular form of racial enslavement that took place during settler colonial beginnings of this nation state. And this is important in order to understand how the legacies of enslavement informed the 2020 uprisings for racial justice that we witnessed, and how the afterlife of slavery, as Saidiya Hartman describes, continues to shape our society today. And this is important for us to move forward and move towards truth and reconciliation as we continue the conversations around the ways that race has shaped the experiences of individuals today in regards to vaccine access, in regards to the impact of COVID, in regards to in education and the desperate outcomes, and the impacts, for example, on Black and Indigenous students. It's important for us to make those connections to these historical roots. What is motivating me in seeing my research through during these challenges times as archives continue to be closed and and things could be challenging at times? For me, what is driving me to continue through and to plow through is the efforts to honor those who were enslaved, historicizing their lives. This includes for me another aspect of my research, the creation of a new archive, a counter archive, if you will, on those that were enslaved in colonial Ontario. Another aim for my research is to spur the creation of more sites of memory to the enslaved, to honor their presence and their humanity. The responses to my talks and articles over the past few months, as well as the responses to the temporary signs, demonstrate that there is an interest, a keen interest in reckoning with our history of enslavement and in keeping the conversation alive through more permanent markers will help to develop a critical collective consciousness of this history as we forge a future, a present and a future that helps to reduce and mitigate the very real impact of the legacies of enslavement. So I'll end it there. Thank you.